much.
Thank you all very much for coming along today to today's seminar. I think it's the 13th in the Deep South Challenge Changing with Our Climate seminar series. Today is a bit of a first for us though. We have expanded our Zoom capacity to allow for 500 online connections and multiple hubs to join across the country. And today we have over 300 people who have registered online, and we have multiple hubs, including at local and central government, in universities and from a number of consultancies. So we're slightly trepidatious that the technology works for us today. The other aspect of this new framework for us is that we can't see all of the participants visually. So hubs and individuals out there, if you're experiencing technical problems, please use the chat panel in Zoom to let us know so that we can try and troubleshoot those in the background. The focus, as you all know, for today's seminar is the research that is just being concluded by Ryan Paulik and Rob Bell of NIWA, looking into flood hazards and climate change. I won't speak about it, I'll leave that to Ryan. Today we have Ryan Paulik presenting the seminar. Rob Bell is actually joining us from a hub at Tasman District Council. So Tasman, if you're connected, I'll try and promote you to a panellist shortly. But Ryan will be conducting the majority of the seminar, and then we'll have 15 to 20 minutes of questions at the end. Rob has to scoot at 1 o'clock on the dot. So if any of you have questions, particularly for Rob, let us know in the chat panel so that we can prioritise those. As far as questions go, it's the same as always with Zoom. You can use the Zoom panel on the left, on the right, to raise your hand, but let us control whether you can speak or not. If you can't access the raise hand function, you can type your question via Zoom. For those of you in hubs, you may need someone to join the Zoom room via a laptop because the AV connections often can't use the raise hand function. So I hope all of that is as clear as mud, and without further ado, I'll hand over to Ryan Paulik.
Yeah, there's 40 people in the room, but 300 people online, so I thought, well, maybe it's a good chance to do some self-promotion. My name's Ryan Paulik. I'm a natural hazard risk researcher at NIWA, and my role at NIWA is leading the Riskgate program, which is a joint venture with Geoscience. So today's presentation is the kind of the wrap-up of 2 years of work for the Deep South Challenge, making a couple of first attempts to extend on previous work that's been done around coastal flood exposure at a national scale. So today's presentation will be on what our kind of aims and objectives of the project were, what some of the differences are between work that's done in the past and what this project extends on. And then getting into some of the details around what coastal and alluvial flood hazard exposure looks like at a national scale, and then some of the findings and recommendations that kind of comes out of our experience through the project. And I've already got a technology issue. Yeah. Right. So before I go through the presentation, I just want to acknowledge the team. Conceptually, these national scale mapping projects are quite simple, but it takes a massive amount of effort to get them over the line. So just want to say thank you to Scott Stevens, Heather Craig, Sanjay Wadwaha, Ben Robinson, Daniel Collins, and Ben Popovich for all their efforts over the last few years. And while we're on acknowledgement, we can't implement these national scale assessments without access to a large range of data sets that are provided by a number of organisations. We use a lot of information from local government and then also central government data sets as well as data that we create around research institutes. So the aims of the project, the objectives of this project were to develop an exposure model framework, and then as well as developing a framework to model exposure, develop the necessary input data sets to model exposure to flood hazards at national scale. We set out with a goal of not just modelling flood exposure for the present day, but also looking at how exposure may change in future climate conditions. These data sets were to be configured at scales which would enable us to produce information at national, regional and territory scales. And with those scales we could develop asset exposure risk profiles for each of those scales for both coastal and alluvial flood inundation hazards. As we get into the findings of the project, I think we were able to achieve this for coastal flood hazards, but there's a lot of, we found a number of issues in trying to do the same type of approach for alluvial flood hazards. In September, we're due to release 2 reports. One is the findings on national scale coastal flood exposure, New Zealand's alluvial and alluvial flood exposure. We're looking to provide the alluvial and alluvial flood exposure reports to our project contributors from local government before this publicly released, because it is the first attempt to model the potential exposure to those hazards at a national scale, and some of the numbers that come out of this work haven't been sort of presented or given any context sort of in the public arena at this stage. So we want to provide the opportunity to our collaborators to have a look at the details and provide feedback before we publicly release that information. So as mentioned, this work extends on previous coastal flood mapping work that's been implemented over the last few years. In 2015, the PCE delivered a first report on what potential asset exposure to sea level rise is across New Zealand. The maps that were produced as part of that work have subsequently been used by local government New Zealand to identify local government assets at risk sea level rise, and then also by the Department of Conservation to map conservation assets at risk from the maps that the PCE produced. So what this project extends on in terms of this work is that the PCE report used a baseline. So I'm going to use the cursor of the mouse here for the benefit of those online, to map the mean high water spring marks around the country, and then add half-metre increments of sea level rise on top of mean high water springs to map what land area above mean high water springs is potentially flooded by sea level rise. These 0.5 metre increments were taken up to 3 metres, and then assets at risk on land exposed within these areas were mapped. So what this current work does is it changes this baseline from mean high water springs to what we've called extreme sea level 1. So this is the 1% chance of extreme sea levels reaching this elevation in any one year. And what that equates to is basically a 1 in 100 year extreme sea level event. So while the PCE work mapped inundation from static sea level rise, static sea level rise above mean high water springs, we've incorporated an extreme sea level event that may be caused by a storm like an ex-tropical cyclone, for instance. as our baseline. And then we've also, as well as mapping the present day exposure to what extreme sea level 1, or ESL1, as we've trimmed it down to. We've also included 10 centimetre increments of sea level rise on top of this base level. We've taken those increments up to 3 metres, which gives us a suite of 31 inundation scenarios for all of New Zealand's coastline where LiDAR topography is available. Where LiDAR topography is not available, we've had to use a satellite-derived DEM to map the extreme sea level 1 plus 3 metres because of the resolution of the DEM. So what this is trying to represent in reality is encapsulated by these images. On the left is a high tide event or a king tide event in Auckland, 2014. This is more indicative of the scenario that was used for the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment report. And on the right is an image from ex-tropical cyclone Fahey in the Hauraki Gulf, where a storm event has led to exacerbation of the flooding. So the work that we just completed for the East South Challenge is more indicative of the scenario on the right, and then looking at how that scenario transforms with additional sea level rise on top of present day mean sea levels. So the products that come out of the modelling exercise is a large suite of flood maps. As mentioned, 31 different maps for areas with LiDAR DEMs. LiDAR DEMs have fairly wide coverage of the New Zealand coastline and are mostly available for coastal towns and cities. Although there are large gaps along the New Zealand coastlines where LiDAR is not available, and obvious ones that jump out is the west coast of the South Island. As mentioned, we were unable to map or produce the suite of 31 maps for the locations of the LiDAR DEM because of the issues with vertical accuracy. So the extreme sea level 1 plus 3 metre scenario for sea level rise scenario for the satellite DEM areas provides an envelope of what could potentially be at risk to coastal flood hazards. The image on the right is from Mission Bay in Auckland, and that just provides an example of the type of the large number of maps that were produced from the study. That represents 16 different flood inundation scenarios from present day up to 1.5 metre sea level rise. So where these maps are available, we can do quite accurate spatial mapping of the elements at risk. The other component of this project was to map fluvial and fluvial flood hazards at a national scale in New Zealand. Because New Zealand doesn't currently have a national flood model set up that we could utilise for this project, we had to kind of scale back our expectations around how we would produce a national scale flood map to create a patchwork of flood maps from those that are publicly available now. So we pulled together flood maps from mostly local government sources that were publicly available, and combined these with flood-prone soil maps. And the reason for doing that was that most modelled flood maps are focused in areas with urban development. Outside of these areas, the patchwork was fairly minimal, I guess, in terms of the rural areas. So the flood-prone soil maps from Landcare Research provided an opportunity to fill in some of these gaps. For the flood maps that were available, we decided to use the maximum flood area. So for any number of floodplains, there could be a range of different flood recurrence interval scenarios available. We chose to use the maximum because that would give us a flood mask for the country and give us kind of the broadest extent of what the floodplains may look like across New Zealand. So any exposure mapping work that we do in terms of locating asset elements at risk within floodplains fits within that broadest extent. But the frequency of flooding within any of these floodplains will be highly variable. So mapping elements exposed to flood hazards is conceptually a fairly simple approach. We overlay a spatial representation of the flood hazard over a spatial representation of assets at risk, or elements at risk. And for this study, the elements at risk that we focused on were population, buildings, infrastructure, so it's transport infrastructure, electricity, this is the national grid, and land cover. And we've calculated numbers of assets and also the extent of the assets that fall within floodplains. So the image on the right is a representation of what we mean by exposure to flood hazards. So we have a man in a floodplain, so that would be our population exposure because he's in contact with water. But the house is also in contact with water, so we would count that as exposed to flood hazards. And the vehicle and the utility pole in the background fall outside the floodplain, so we wouldn't count that as exposed. So that's the basic modelling approach that we would apply in a GIS or a tool like Riskcape to model exposure to flood hazards using the suite of maps that we've created. In terms of the spatial data related to the elements at risk, we use the 2013 census information because the most recent census information wasn't available at the time. And I guess it's worth pointing out that one of the pitfalls of using these data sets is that they're out of date as soon as you use them. So, I think there's certainly some ongoing improvements to the findings of this study that can be made. So we also included a national building inventory that's been created by the Riskcape project by NIWA and GNS Science. Transport assets, the features came from NZTA, also LINS. Electricity is represented by the national grid in the absence of having access to distribution networks information. Free waters, nodes and pipeline data sets came from local government, and then land cover, we used the land cover database from Landcare Research. And the approach, because of the range of scales that we were reporting at from national through to territory levels, and the spatial scales of the maps that we were using, we took an approach where we were identifying the individual features for these elements at risk that fall within floodplains. So rather than using, say, something like a mesh block, which counts, say, numbers of buildings at a mesh block scale, we're locating individual building features and then aggregating those numbers of building features that fall within floodplains to national, regional and territorial scales. So the approach that we're taking is quite scalable from an individual object right up to a national level. But it also has meant that we decided to trim back some of the attribute information about those elements at risk because of the inconsistencies of that information being available for individual features. So, for instance, we might have, say, building features represented, but we may be missing some of the key attribute information. So we couldn't consistently report on those attributes at a national scale. So in reporting the individual features that fall within floodplains, we're identifying the counts of the features, but also some information about the magnitude. So this is things like road length in terms of kilometres and land cover area in terms of square kilometres. So there's always a range of caveats with mapping flood hazards at a national scale, and we had to make some simplifications to the methodology in order to make this happen, I guess. So some of the key caveats for the coastal flood maps is that we use the bathtub mapping technique. And what that means is that we're essentially raising the elevation of the sea level and then projecting that sea level straight onto land. So we've really simplified the physics in terms of the way that water moves across land. So obviously having obstacles like different elevations in terms of topography, buildings, etc. slows down the flow of water across the land in a flood event. We're assuming that the water just projects straight onto land and sticks with the elevation that represents the extreme sea level and the sea level rise value. In taking this approach, we're assuming that any land area below extreme sea level and the sea level rise value is inundated. So this would tend to overestimate potentially the inundation for certain areas. And this approach also means that both low-lying land that's connected and disconnected from the sea is included in these maps. So it kind of creates a worst case of what the potential flood extents could be. And I think I've covered off the caveats for the flood hazard map. So a national model was not used for this study. Only publicly available flood maps were used, so there could be others out there that may not be represented in this data set. A range of frequencies and magnitudes in terms of flood return periods are represented in the flood maps. And then also the flood maps may or may not include residual risk. So by residual risk, I mean this could be the flooding that occurs, say, in an area that may be protected. So for instance, areas that are protected by stop banks, if the flood map assumes that the water is contained within the stop bank, then that's what the map represents. But there may be a risk outside of beyond the stop bank of flooding for the land. So that was the modelling methodology that was used, and now these are the national exposure profiles that have come out of this modelling exercise. So I'll mostly cover off the coastal flooding results through these national national and regional risk profiles, and then also I'll summarise the national scale results for the alluvial and fluvial flood hazards. So I think what comes out of across most of the elements at risk is that within the first metre of sea level rise, we see quite a dramatic change in exposure. So for starting with population, the current exposure to extreme sea level 1, we've mapped about 72,000 people within those floodplains. Now, this value more than doubles by just 0.8 metres of sea level rise. With a metre of sea level rise, we're looking at an increase to about 177,000 people. So there's an extra 100,000 people at risk within these floodplains with only a metre of sea level rise. Now, there's a few locations around New Zealand where where people and buildings are quite heavily represented in these results. In the case of population, Canterbury, Otago and Bay of Plenty have more than 10,000 people currently within the extreme sea level 1 floodplain. And in the case of Canterbury, this increases to 51,000 people. So with 1 metre of sea level rise. So with not a lot of sea level rise brings a lot more people on in terms of exposure. And in Christchurch City, which had the highest population exposure in the current floodplain, the population exposure triples over 0.8 metres sea level rise to 33,000 people. So buildings follow a similar trend to the population exposure, which kind of makes sense because we used usually resident population values from the census data. Currently, there's almost 50,000 buildings at risk within current extreme sea level 1 floodplain. But we see roughly a linear trend in terms of sea level rise where just over 7,000 buildings with a value of almost $2.5 billion becomes exposed for every 10 centimetres of sea level rise. And again in Canterbury, also the Bay of Plenty and Hawke's Bay, with less than half a metre of sea level rise, over 10,000 buildings are exposed in these areas to sea level 1. We also see in the first metre of sea level rise that for major urban areas like Wellington, there's a large shift in terms of the replacement cost exposed as the central business areas become inundated by these scenarios. So a lot more high value buildings are coming online in terms of risk with not a lot of sea level rise. And then obviously Christchurch City is again represented in terms of numbers of buildings exposed, and then Napier as well for Hawke's Bay. So some of these low-lying cities located close to estuaries with large urban populations are quite exposed to these scenarios. So for the transport network, in this study we covered off roads, railways and airports. There's 13 international and domestic airports exposed within the current extreme sea level 1 floodplain. Road and railway exposure increases respectively by 130 kilometres and 10 kilometres for every 10 centimetres of sea level rise, which on top of, in the case of roads, 1,400 kilometres of road exposure to the current extreme sea level 1 floodplain. It's quite a high number of roads. Breaking this down into regions, Waikato and Canterbury are highly represented in these numbers, and both have over 500 kilometres of road network exposed with only 1 metre of sea level rise. And breaking this down into territories, Hauraki District and both Christchurch City were the most exposed areas in terms of the road network. And they represent different, I guess, different landscapes in terms of rural and urban as well. So it's not just the urban road network that's at risk, it's also the rural road network in these areas. So in terms of Three Waters, with only half a metre or so of sea level rise, we're looking at really big numbers nationally in terms of the length of pipe network exposed, as well as the nodes as well that connect the pipes together. Most of these values come from a few regions, with Hawke's Bay, Wellington and Canterbury being highly represented in these numbers. And then also for territories, we're seeing the same story in terms of Christchurch City and Napier, these low-lying urban areas close to estuaries that are highly represented both in the current exposure to extreme sea levels, but also as sea levels rise as well. In terms of land cover, there's over 2,000 square kilometres of land potentially exposed within the current extreme sea level 1 floodplain. And most of this land area is represented by production land. Again, the Waikato and Hauraki District sort of like highly represented in these numbers, and most of this land as well is production land. It's probably worth mentioning that as well as a large number of buildings, Canterbury and Christchurch City also has a large area of built environment exposed as well. So whether buildings are there or not, the land that falls within the urban limits is highly exposed. So that has also effects on community values associated with parks and other facilities. So those were the risk profiles that were presented at a regional level for some of the elements that we mapped. I guess some of the general trends that are coming out of all that information is that at a national scale we see a relatively linear increase in terms of elements at risk in the sea level rise. I guess within this trend there's a kind of a short-term increase in terms of the rate at which these elements become exposed, and this generally falls within the first metre of sea level rise. At a regional scale, we start to see different trends in terms of the ways that the elements are being exposed. So what we've plotted up here is the red curve represents a moving average, and we can start to see from that moving average where sort of like the relative rates of sea level exposure of elements to sea level rise are occurring. So Auckland has a relatively gradual sort of increase in terms of the average exposure rate. Hawke's Bay, in the first metre of sea level rise, has a relatively rapid exposure, which then begins to fall over time. Canterbury is fairly linear, and then also Otago has quite a high exposure to extreme sea levels in the present day, and I guess this is probably mostly represented by the South Dunedin area. But after with increasing sea levels beyond present day, the exposure rate is relatively low. So most people are familiar with this figure that's come out of the 2015 MFE guidance. And I guess one thing that we can start to do with our exposure information is to relate the values represented to different points in time. So I've included in the table on the right the length of the Auckland region's road network that's exposed to extreme sea level 1 under different sea level rise scenarios. And these sea level rise scenarios are matched with time periods associated with the different RCPs reported in the MFE guidance for projected sea levels. And I guess one thing to point out is that while we can map or pick out a map and exposure values related to a sea level rise scenario, is that the time period associated with that map can change quite dramatically, and change in terms of the further we get into the future, the broader the time frame for that sea level rise coming online occurs. So using 0.3 metres as an example of sea level rise, there's potentially a 25 period in which this may occur based on the projected scenarios. And that roughly equates to 70 kilometres of road exposure. At 0.6 metres, this time frame extends out to 60 years. And there's around 100, I think it's 100 kilometres of road exposure. So, and then also for any given year, the sea level rise, the projected sea level rise will vary as well. So we've produced, I guess, some context as what elements are exposed at these different points in time. And then that can be used to inform how best to adapt to make these elements at risk more resilient and over what time period should those activities come about. So that was the coastal flood exposure work. The national fluvial flood exposure mapping I've just summarised in a single slide. As mentioned earlier, we hope to put these numbers out to the local government contributors to the project for their review before a public release. But if we can summarise these numbers, they are quite large, and I guess the approach taken to map the floodplains has been quite broad. So we have picked the maximum flood extents out of the available maps, and then overlaid these on the assets and elements at risk. So population potentially at risk is over 670,000 people residing within these floodplains, and over 400,000 buildings with an estimated replacement value of over over $130 billion. The road network that falls within these areas is also quite extensive, almost 20,000 kilometres of roads. As are Three Waters assets, over 20,000 kilometres of pipeline. And again, production land is heavily represented in the just over 20,000 kilometres of land that falls within these areas, over 15,000 square kilometres of land, potentially exposed to flood hazards. It would come as no surprise that the population and building values are highly represented in urban areas. And I guess there could be a bias here in terms of generally the greater focus for modelling flood hazards concentrates on urban areas, because that's where, I guess, the higher value elements at risk are, and where a lot of the decisions around floodplain management are being made. But we also see out in the regions, locations like I guess Waikato and the Hauraki district and Southland region, that there are huge tracts of production land potentially exposed to flood hazards, which would, if inundated, have a significant impact on local economies. So, just to summarise some of the challenges and opportunities that have come out of this project, what we've done here is a first attempt at putting an event in front of some of these sea level rise values in terms of the coastal flood hazard, and also a first attempt at bringing together as much information about fluvial and fluvial flood hazards as we can find, and putting that together as a patchwork of maps which we can then use for exposure modelling. The coastal flood maps only represent one scenario, which is 1% exceedance probability extreme sea level. That scenario was chosen because of the New Zealand Coastal Policy Statement and the requirements to assess natural hazards over a 100-year timeframe. But there's a whole bunch of other needs in terms of what coastal flood exposure looks like at more frequent return periods. And I guess with sea level rise, there's the potential for more frequent extreme sea level events to become more of a nuisance and more of a hindrance on the way that our society operates. So, starting with the 1% extreme sea level scenario, we need to expand that out to include different extreme sea level return periods and frequencies. We used what we would call a 1D map, so it's a sort of plan view representation of the flood hazard. But in order to extend from our modelling from exposure into impacts, we need information about what that depth of flooding is across the land. So we can start to see what's exposed and by how much, and then what the consequences of that exposure would be. And sort of carrying on the approach of modelling events, there's also the need for joint probability modelling with what happens at that sort of coastal and river interface, where you have a storm event occurring and potentially water coming down the river as well as coming in from the sea, and what that does to the flood hazard in these areas. And because we have a number of urban areas located close to these kind of environments, it can have a reasonably large bearing on the extent of potential exposure of elements at risk within any one storm event. And then also to extend out this work around the entire coastline of New Zealand, LiDAR coverage is absolutely essential for reducing the resolution of maps that enables us to get into the detail of mapping individual elements at risk to coastal flooding. A lot of these needs sort of carry over into the fluvial flood inundation space, and I guess the development of a national flood model would enable us to consistently model flooding and map flooding across the country, but it would also enable us to sort of stress test different climate change variables and how these change the flood dynamics over the future. And then also there's the need to start to incorporate residual risk into these models as well. So we're not just modelling our kind of like idealised events, but we're also modelling events and exposure to flooding when say things go wrong and infrastructure fails. So summarise the project. Again, it's the first attempt to model coastal flooding from an event plus sea level rise. And then also a first attempt to try and understand a bit better what's exposed within New Zealand's floodplains. And there's obviously a lot more work to be done to fine-tune this information. I guess the key takeaway is that currently we have in New Zealand a lot of elements potentially at risk to present-day coastal flooding and also fluvial flood hazards. And in the case of coastal flooding, we see quite a dramatic increase in terms of the exposure of elements at risk with not a lot of sea level rise. So within that first metre of sea level rise, we're looking at doubling or tripling the current exposure of elements at risk to coastal flooding. And then, I think like most of these projects, there's more questions than answers, and there's the need to start to progress mapping of more coastal and fluvial flood inundation scenarios, and then start to build this information into informing risk assessment and supporting adaptation planning for these hazards in the future.
Already that have been asked by the Q&A dialogue panel in Zoom. Just a reminder to Zoom participants that you can raise your hand in the right-hand panel. If you're present physically in a room, you can just wave your hand wildly and hopefully I'll pick you up on the video screen. Right here. The first question is from Alex McMillan. Perhaps more of a comment. Interesting that it's only the dollar value of buildings as assets that are considered, which privileges commercial buildings, whereas houses and in particular homes are what people value, even though they may be worth less in monetary terms. Comments from the panellists, which is Ryan.
Yeah, I guess that's a fair comment, and I guess if we're modelling natural hazard risk, the first step in the modelling process is just to figure out what's at risk. So I guess across a full-scale risk assessment, this would be providing that kind of first analysis of what's potentially at risk. And then we from there, we try to figure out the details of what we're interested in. So in this case, the National Building Inventory had replacement cost values that were consistently available across New Zealand. But I would assume that any more detailed work would fine-tune those replacement cost values so that, say, commercial buildings aren't necessarily overrepresented relative to another type of building. So, not sure if that answers the question, but replacement cost value exposure is just something that we had available that we could report consistently across the country. Other direct and I guess indirect sort of impacts would need to come through the sort of more full-scale risk assessment process.
Thanks, Ryan. I'll just deal with a quick question from Sunny Whitelaw. Sunny, she's asked when the reports will be available to the public. So the two reports, one on the coastal flooding and one on fluvial, will both be released sometime in September. And on that note, if you aren't already signed up to the Deep South Challenge newsletter, please do so. You can find the link on our website, deepsouthchallenge.co.nz. I'll take a question from Daniel McMullen and then a question from here in the NIWA room. Daniel says, thanks for sharing. Were local storm surge contributions used in the ESL1 estimate or was a blanketed approach used? And can you comment on the storm surge percentage contribution to the overall ESL1 values?
Rob, are you online? Oh, okay. Yeah, Rob Bell is probably the best place to answer this question. But yes, the extreme sea level values were identified from sea level records. Now, because sea level records are fixed to a location, like a tide gauge, there was a method developed to interpolate the extreme sea level elevations along the coastline where sea level records were available. So the methodology is outlined in the report that we made available on the Deep South Challenge website. And following on from that, Scott Stevens and Rob Bell's team in Hamilton would be the best point of contact to find out more information about the methodology.
Could I ask you to come up to the microphone to speak a question so that participants in other hubs can hear you and introduce yourself?
Juliet from NIWA. Thanks, Ryan, for that presentation. I have a broader question that you touched on right at the start about you're going to share that second report with some of the research partners before the reports are released, and I'm just interested in the wider comms strategy, because when these reports get released, communicating what was done, the fact that it was a first look, the fact that it's necessarily conservative, the fact that it's one dimensional, that it's an estimate of risk, exposure rather than inundation, all of the impact, or all of those things that you've got to try and communicate to avoid public panic. Just curious on what the strategy will be about communication.
Thank you, that's a wonderful question and the current challenge we're trying to grapple with in the background. The key point is that we are grappling with that challenge, but the point of the National Science Challenges is to make our research publicly available. So we will be doing that, and we will be trying to do our best to inform, educate, explain the limitations of the research. But we're finding in general that our public is highly literate, that our media community is doing a huge amount of work to interpret the research well. So hopefully our strategy will work. We have a question from Liam Foster. What was the rough split of exposure between fluvial and coastal hazards?
Yeah, I guess we haven't made that split yet because we initially had ideas about where we would keep things consistent in terms of the 100-year event, which would have enabled us to identify that potential split. But because we weren't able to do that consistently across the country, then I guess we haven't been able to figure out what that is entirely. I guess if we took the extreme sea level 1 and plus 3 metres sea level rise and the coastal, the fluvial flood map, just off the top of my head, the population exposure on the coast is over 350,000 people, and then within the fluvial floodplain it's 670,000 people. So, I guess there's still work to be done. to figure out what that split is. And that'll come through more consistent mapping of the different flood, both in terms of coastal and fluvial recurrence intervals.
We have a question from Jackie Jo. Could you please give more details about quote unquote redevelopment value 2016 NZ dollars?
Yeah, so those are building replacement cost values. So that is the value of the building to replace it to its, I guess it's in a risk modelling term, to its pre-damage condition. We actually get those replacement cost values from quotable value cost builder guidelines. The way that we assign them to buildings is that we use a number of attributes about the building to best fit an individual building to, I guess, the categories that are in the Kiwi cost builder guidance, and then we work out, based on the floor square metre dollar value, what the value of that building is.
There's a question, or a sort of a series of questions from Tiahu Ngā Morihu. I'm just going to paraphrase them. I hope that this represents your question properly. The questioner is asking whether, I suppose, there's enough, whether just taking the projections to 3 metres sea level rise is enough, considering what's potentially on the horizon.
Another question for Rob. I guess the modelling approach that we've used is flexible enough so that we can apply the same approach to model exposure to, say, 6 metres of sea level rise. It's exactly the same as, say, 3 metres of sea level rise. So depending on what the interest is, the methodology is flexible enough to switch in and out different hazard scenarios and look at what the exposure from those hazard scenarios are.
A question from Chris Cameron. Have you also looked at non-financial values, social, cultural, environmental values in those areas affected?
So the answer is no, but I guess that's a future piece of work that could be done using essentially the same methodology. We would need, however, spatial information which represents those elements at risk. And then depending on whether exposure or impact is of interest, that would require extra information, such as a vulnerability model, for instance, that represents the impact from that element being exposed to flood hazards.
So there's a sort of a group of questions around which IPC scenarios are being modelled, I guess. And one question is, which IPC scenario by emission aligned with sea level rise analysis? And when is the second analysis anticipated? And a secondary question or a related question is, why is 1 metre sea level rise the focus when we're not meeting our Paris target? So the approach that we took to develop a suite of sea level rise maps for extreme sea level 1 was so that as the advice around projections change, we can interpolate maps between sea level projections, so that if the time frame for when the sea level rise value will be met in the future changes, we don't necessarily have to reproduce the maps in order to represent that scenario. So, 1 second. I was reading, I wasn't listening.
Oh. Sorry, I forgot the second part of the question.
Will you be doing when's the second study plan? Will there be a second reanalysis?
Yeah, so I think the framework is in place now to extend the range of extreme sea level 1 and sea level rise scenarios. I guess we might be looking towards the second phase of the Deep South Challenge to progress some of this research.
A question from Dion Cowley. What about wave run-up and increased storm intensity?
So wave runout was excluded in the extreme sea level 1 values. We have wave setup included in those values. So this is the temporal elevation of water against the coastline when you have wind blowing water against the coast. Wave run-up and waves is a piece of work that would need to be done at a later point. It potentially requires sort of dynamic modelling as opposed to bathtub mapping to address some of the effects of waves.
This is a question from Francesca Eggleton, which may have been covered in the presentation. Did you look at the area of farmland exposed?
So for this study, because we had available the land cover database for spatial data from Landcare Research, the land cover classes are aggregated. So we tied high producing and low producing grassland, for instance, together as production land. So included in those areas would be a lot of farms. But what those individual areas represent in terms of the farm type, we haven't got to that level of detail yet.
This is one question that I missed, sorry, Catherine. Maybe more of a comment than a question. She says, all of the exposed areas will be flooded, it's just a matter of when and how quickly. I think this is important to get across to the public. This might be our last question, Ryan, so perhaps you could answer that, and if you want to provide any kind of bigger picture summary or some final comments.
Yeah, I guess, so with the approach that we've taken, one thing to keep in mind is while these numbers are really big, they do represent flooding from coastal storm events, or potential flooding from coastal storm events. So the actual effects or the potential exposure will be highly variable around the New Zealand coastline, and variable both in terms of individual storm events as well. So, so there's potentially a number of factors at play in any one location which determines the level of exposure to coastal flood inundation. So this type of analysis provides a high-level representation of where the relative exposure is around the New Zealand coastline. And what that means for any individual location requires this work to be taken to the next stage, which is looking at sort of the local context on what's driving exposure to coastal flooding and other flood hazards.
Thank you, Ryan. That was an intense question and answer session. We've come to the end of our time. I just wanted to thank Ryan and potentially to thank Rob if he's out there somewhere. And you'll be hearing more from both of them and from us in relation to their research in the coming weeks and months. Also to let you know of our next two seminars. In October we'll have a seminar with Patrick Walsh on his research looking into flood mitigation schemes. That's the voluntary levies that are paid to councils to maintain stock banks and other flood mitigation measures, and his research is looking at whether those schemes are working and whether they're equitable. So that's in October, and stepping back in September we have Shona Mackie presenting on her research modelling ice melt in the New Zealand Earth System model. There's nothing much more topical than melting ice at our polar extremes, so please stay in touch and come along to that seminar as well. And as I said before, sign up to our newsletter, and following us on social media is a way to make sure you're always aware of research as it's coming out. Thank you very much for joining us. If you have any gripes, technical issues that you'd like to troubleshoot, get in touch with me after the seminar. Thank you again.